Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm sure a few other people will join us. Today is indeed International Holocaust Day. And Joyce just said to me, didn't I teach this morning? Yes, I did. I had a short story book, and it was a short story from the 1960s by Joanna Greenwood. And she actually wrote, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Oh. That's her claim to fame, which is about mental health, and she didn't use her real name. Anyway, this is a story about going to a Navajo reservation, Navajo native land. And we had a whole discussion about, you say native land, you don't say reservation, you say Native American, you don't say anything. But at one point, someone said, this is like the Holocaust, that there was, we massacred, the American government massacred so many Native Americans. And I said that I feel reticent to equivocate anything to the Holocaust because it was a genocide and so on and so forth. And I think that as we go on, it dilutes, for me, it dilutes what we're talking, it's International Holocaust Day today. And it dilutes what's happening. And I think International Holocaust Day is, if I can say, confusing, because we have Yom HaShoah, which is, the Shoah is the Holocaust, the Day of Remembrance. It's a commemoration in Israel. You have the day off. They sound a siren. Everyone comes to attention. If you're on the highway, everything stops. And to have this now is, like we're having a speaker that's closer to Yom HaShoah. Now, one year I couldn't get a speaker close to Yom HaShoah, but I could get it close to International Holocaust Day, and I made that work. But it's very hard. And I've had friends who've said to me, if you could only teach one lesson, what would it be? I said, well, to, a group of students, and this particular friend said, he goes, I would do Holocaust. I said, I would not do Holocaust. Holocaust is important. We have it. And there is, in Illinois, you have to teach it. And so our kids in Highland Park, they're getting it at school, and hopefully we can, work with what they're doing there. I want to share my screen for 1 minute. So,
Are you on sentence?
Let's see. Okay, so you can see this. This is from that's Rick Jacobs, and he came out with, it's not helpful to try to ensconce the definition across every area of the federal government. And this was a common and increasingly controversial definition of anti-Semitism is helpful, but should not be given the force of law. That's why the reform movement, you know who that is, had to say in a statement published Monday about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. This definition includes 11 examples of how anti-Semitism can manifest, mostly involving speech about Israel. And I went to their website, and here it is. Again, full transparency. I'd never been to this website. I try to keep abreast of what's happening and, Jewish current events. And let's see if they'll clarify what anti-Semitism is. some of these,
We're not getting the website.
pardon?
We're not getting the website.
Oh, you're not getting it? Okay, so I'm going to stop my share. I would like to hear from you now. How do you feel about International Holocaust Day? How do you feel about, the confluence with anti-Semitism and the Holocaust? Anybody, just unmute yourself and go. Susan, you need to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Well, first of all, one of the things I think we need to be aware of is education about the Holocaust, which I do think is very important because I think it's part of history and it's something that people should be aware of what happens when there's genocide. When one group of people is singled out for destruction. And in the United States, there are still only 34 states that actually mandate Holocaust training. Holocaust education in their schools. And I think it should be a federal. I think it needs to be everywhere. Everyone needs to learn about this. I will say, you talked about Highland Park, that I have grandchildren that live in River Forest, which is not exactly what you'd call a community like Highland Park. It's a community, of very privileged Gentile people and some Jews. And they were all taken to the Illinois Holocaust Museum from their schools for a field trip. And I thought that was important because they weren't just getting it in school, they were taken on a field trip to see the museum and to hear the lectures.
When the museum opened, the other educational directors and I were stunned to find out it was closed on Sunday. We're like, closed? Like, how do we? But really, the majority of their, the people who come in and, the fees and so on and so forth are these school groups. And they have different exhibits there.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had planned before COVID to go because they had an exhibit on Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right.
And they had another exhibit last year, and I went with my husband. It was about, I can't remember his name, but somebody who was involved with the Grateful Dead, of all things. And my husband loves the Grateful Dead. And it was like, again, but it got people into the museum. And they have opened on Sundays. And, I would love to go. And we're just going to have to wait. But it was fascinating to me. I guess, we're very egocentric that, oh yeah, this is important for other people to go and see it. About 15 years ago, the then Board of Jewish Education, it's now part of JUF, sent educators to Mississippi to teach. And my group went to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and I will never forget it. And we asked them, what do you want us to teach? And they wanted us to teach Mourner's Kaddish because they were getting old and they didn't know it. And it was a building, they had a nice building. Nobody really knew Hebrew. They had a soloist and they put a sticky in the Torah for when to read for High Holy Days. And one of the things they did, though, was go out to the community and talk about the Holocaust. And, I think about Jews in small towns. Many of them were intermarried and their kids were intermarried, or their kids that married Jews and moved away. And and we toured, we toured the battleground. And they told, I learned that Abraham Lincoln had the first Jewish chaplain, and we went, everyone has like bullets in their Civil War bullets in their yards because it was this terrible battlefield. And it was heartbreaking that they were dying off and what was going to happen with the Jewish presence. However, one thing that was just that was sad, but what was disturbing is we had an African-American bus driver. And we said, and they made us dinner. And we told them we were kosher and that it was mixing meat and milk, but we went in and we invited the bus driver to come and eat with us. And they were like, oh, I'm sure he'll feel more, African-American bus driver, he'll feel more comfortable in the kitchen with their African-American maintenance person. And we were shocked. Because I don't think they didn't want that. And, whether it was segregation or whatever, I mean, these were older, remember this is 15, 20 years ago. So I'll never forget that as well. And we had a couple Israeli educators, and they were super shocked. The rest of us were like, this is the South. So when I think about, Holocaust education, anti-Semitism, most of these people, I think for the most part, were good ambassadors to the community. What's happening in those communities now?
Vanessa,
Yeah.
I don't mean to monopolize this with my
No,
own.
it's okay. I'll get other people.
But I was in Vicksburg about 4 years ago, and we were on a bus tour of the battlefields and everything. And the guide, who was a Southern gentleman, started to talk about, and one of the people on the tour asked about slavery because he was talking about the cotton fields and everything. And he was excusing slavery because it had allowed Mississippi and the South to become so economically independent because of the South, because of the cotton, and that they worked and did such good jobs in the cotton fields. And so most of us just said, well, would it have killed you to pay them? You could have still been, if you had paid help to pick the cotton, it still would have prospered.
Yeah, I don't think
the man, if this was only 4 years ago, he was still making excuses for it.
Absolutely. Merle, go ahead.
Susan, I just would like to answer your question that they have something called the plantation economy. I think you can look it up on Wikipedia. And it wasn't that they didn't want to pay them, but if they paid them, they would have made no money at all because picking cotton was so labor intensive. And I lived in the South for a while at Fayetteville, North Carolina. That Marilyn knows my deceased sister and brother-in-law. He was in the Army. And I lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina for 2 summers. And it was in the 50s, separate drinking fountains. Everything was separate at the counter. I mean, it was like living in a different world. And at midnight, they played, they didn't play our national anthem. They played, I Wish I Were in the Land of Cotton. Old times they're not forgotten. It was like being in a different country. So it was called the plantation economy.
It's, and it's still there. And I think, we have to get the word out. And as Susan said, we have to educate, and it should be as federal. I'm glad in Illinois that we have to teach it. And, it's so important. You think about all the kids downstate, they need to learn about this. One quick anecdote. My son-in-law is from North Carolina. And so he said he told the band that he wanted something Southern. And thank God for Rabbi Ike, he married them. He heard the band talking that they were going to play Dixie. And I was like, you're playing Dixie at the wedding? And, for 1 minute, I was like, oh my gosh. So, there's just certain things as we have different sensibilities as Northerners, and they, it's the war between the states. It's not the Civil War and so on and so forth. But on International Holocaust Day, and it'll be, I try to watch the news. I try to get home to watch, the 5:30 news. It'll be interesting to see, are they talking about it? What do people have to say about it? Joyce, go ahead. No, you're not mute. I can hear you.
You started by saying, why do we need International Holocaust Day?
Right.
We can use anything we can get to educate all the others who are not Jewish and who are, to some extent, as the years pass by and the Holocaust itself becomes more dated in terms of the absolute chronology, we need to be reminding people, and I see no harm in having our own Holocaust Remembrance Day and a national holiday. When you talk holiday, I don't call it, something.
A commemoration.
Commemoration. There is absolutely every reason to applaud our effort to bring it to the attention of all people of all religions to benefit and hopefully never see anything even anywhere near as awful in terms of isolating one population from the rest to exterminate them.
Peggy.
An interesting side note, my grandson had his bar mitzvah. He lives in Downers Grove, and he is the only Jewish boy that was in the class. So when he invited his friends to the bar mitzvah, the parents came with them because they had never seen a bar mitzvah. So you don't have to go into rural areas to recognize that. I mean, and they were they were the best crowd that they had because, the North Shore, the kids are, they have to be watched. These kids were with their parents. Parents wanted to see it. And the party at night, one of the kids rented a tux because he didn't know what you wear to a bar mitzvah. But I also, one other thing is,
Okay.
there's one article, I don't know if you guys read the one about the Holocaust in the Tribune today. Did you read that?
Susan talked about that.
Oh, okay. I found that really fascinating and truthful and came out a little late.
Yeah. I will go home this evening and read it. And listen, I grew up in Crystal Lake. There's no other Jews there. I was they put our picture on the paper when we celebrated Hanukkah. And to this day, so we read Anne Frank as a play in 6th grade. And my teacher was very nice, but she wanted me to comment on it. And I was a little traumatized, right. Well, if they come for me and who would hide me. And, I was 12 and,
right.
I hadn't done any Holocaust studies. And of course, today, our kids are exposed to so much screen time. And I think they know what Nazis are. And then, they go back and find out about the Holocaust. And, we keep going back to January 6th, but the man who had Camp Auschwitz.
Right.
And, Susan, did you say, by putting Auschwitz as the center point, is that?
Well, he says it trivializes the whole concept. And it's I just recommend everybody should read it. It's educational too, because I learned things that I knew about all the other camps and everything, but even the fact that the genocide continued to go on after the end of the war in Poland, they were still killing Jews.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. No. And they talk about the United States being the great liberators. Well, that's not the truth. No. So you need to read it. It's very interesting.
I will go back and read it. And certainly in Poland, when people went back to their houses, there were other people living in them and just shut the door and said, get out of here. There was rampant anti-Semitism in Poland and Eastern Europe. And that's what, Hitler was successful. Peggy?
The movie 1945. Have you seen that?
No. Good.
Oh, you should see it. It's about, I'm not going to say much about it, but it's about a Jewish family that returned to their town. Yeah, it's done in Polish, but with subtitles. It was last year's we saw it in Arizona, and they, the Jewish
In a
film
theater.
festival. But it's on Netflix.
Okay.
And I'm going to watch it again. So 1945, it is, that's exactly what it addresses. It's very moving to see, and
Yeah.
how people reacted after that.
Yeah.
But one other thing, the
Yes.
Holocaust Museum had paid for the Downers Grove kids to attend. That's part of their curriculum, which I applaud.
Yeah, I think that first of all, if you haven't been to our museum, you should go. I think that I think a couple of things. I was at Yad Vashem, in the late, 79, 1980, and it was a beautiful memorial. And once the Holocaust Museum opened, 20, 30 years later in DC, that changed, I believe, changed experiences in all museums. It was interactive, it had computers, it was, and if you haven't been to the one in Washington, DC, it's outstanding.
Mhm.
Yad Vashem has since changed and remodeled, and I have also seen, I was there in 2013, I think, and it's got videos, and it's very moving. And in DC, they have those rooms full of people's clothes or shoes,
Yeah.
hair, or sunglasses, or glasses, the glasses. And you don't forget that. And Yad Vashem also now has some type of exhibits like that. And I believe they were forced to change. That, that experience was so immersive that Yad Vashem had to change. And of course, in Israel, you have to do Holocaust education there as well. All the kids go, Arabs, Israeli, Christians, they have to go to Yad Vashem. And in Hebrew high school, not Hebrew, but in Israeli high school, they take a obligatory trip to Poland. And it's very moving. It's, that is something, that they're just getting ready to go, into the army. And so, Marcia Rosenbaum, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm a charter member of the Holocaust Museum in DC. And so the first, very early on, I don't know if it's the first year that it was dedicated or whatever, but I was in Crystal City, right outside of Washington, DC for a conference, and my kids were with me, my twins, the ones that had been to Poland, and I took them through it, and it was it was our first time, and I was absolutely traumatized. And they said, Mom, they had just come back from Poland, with on that SKIP program, and they had been to Auschwitz and then into towns where they saw where like the mezuzahs had been ripped off the doors and off. And when they were in Auschwitz, they saw the toothbrushes and, and they said, these are replicas. They said, Mom, after Poland, this is like, it's like whitewashed. It's not, it's not the real thing, but, but still it had a lot of impact. But you're right. There was no place for these people to go back to. The towns were just decimated. And I just read with my book club, the tattooist
of Auschwitz.
Of Auschwitz, yeah. It's every page is heartbreaking, but
there's a lot of controversy about that book because it's it's not based on truth. And some of my book club, my Jewish colleagues who run Jewish book clubs, really don't like it.
Yeah, well, they're right. The reviews were very mixed and there was a lot of controversy about it, but it is really based on this man's life. And I think what it shows, though, that in the midst of such horror and death and hatred, there's resilience and hope and strength and determination. And I think that's the message to get out of it, whether everything is believable or not. I mean, there were tons of coincidences and just amazingly constantly him having good luck. But also he was a personable guy. And it also showed you that on a one-to-one relationship, it's hard to hate. It's such terrible anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, whatever. It's a concept that's not based on anything humanity. I mean, we all know that.
Right. I think, when you make when you demonize the other, that's when you have conflicts and that starts happening. But I will also share with you that, many years at Legacy Lakeside, I did family education. And the thing that was the most well-attended family education, adult enrichment, was when I brought a survivor. And I would fill the sanctuary, and we had a big sanctuary, and people always responded to it. This year on April 11th, we're actually having the son of Eva Core. I don't know if she died, I think last year, and she had a museum in Indiana and it burned down, and she was amazing. And I'm sure her son is going to talk about that. But it always, I got why, but I was, I don't want to say surprised, but like, what draws people to these types of programs? Yeah, Stephanie?
Oh, sorry, I'm not muted?
No, that's okay.
I'm the
If
dog.
you want to say something.
No, I'm sorry, I was just.
Okay, right. But anybody else? Paula?
Well, I think that having gone through this past year feeling very isolated, in retrospect, it was not something I was conscious of, but I think the curiosity of listening to the personal history of somebody who went through so much oppression can give you so much insight into the strength and the resilience of humanity and the beauty of the human spirit. So is it morbid curiosity or is it human nature to want to know more?
Yeah.
But to think of the incredible suffering that people went through, it's unimaginable.
It's unimaginable.
Unimaginable. And so maybe that's what draws us to hear the stories of the survivors.
Yeah, Marilyn. And then Peggy.
I always love the writings, and I say this all the time, probably in all the classes, you've heard me say it before, Rabbi Sachs. And he says in one of his podcasts how when he's learned more from Holocaust survivors than from any other people, because he said they are resilient in that they go forward. They don't go back. They lose their whole family, some of them, and then they come to this country and they start a new life and they raise a new family and they get a new occupation. He said, you can't learn more from any other group that you can learn from the survivor. And I just think it's so wonderful that he emphasizes that in his lessons, because he talks about the fact that we all know that many of the survivors don't tell their story. They don't want to talk about it. And it isn't sometimes, he says, 50 years later, that sometimes they'll begin to speak, a lot of them sooner. And then again, we know, as you say, we have the survivors who will address our audiences, but they have remarkable resilience. And we can be so proud. And I know how devastating their lives were, but we can be so proud of how they affect the rest of us in this world, how proud we are, and what lessons we learn from them, and to meet them personally and to actually witness a survivor. It tells so much more than we could ever express. It is so layered. My grandson called me and he said, Graham, today, this was a few years ago, we had a Holocaust survivor come to our school. And he said, after he spoke, he said, I was so moved, I couldn't let him go until I went up and shook his hand.
Oh,
And so he said, I shook his hand and I put my arms around him and I took a picture to send to you because I knew it would mean as much to you as it does to me. And I was so touched, and I still have that picture.
Good.
So.
Absolutely. Peggy?
well, we met some lovely people when we were in Florida from Germany. We went to Germany. They met us there, and we talked a lot about the education that the German people, it's mandatory that they have a Holocaust education, and not just for 2 weeks. And when we took tours, and we did all over Germany, we went on a road trip, and every time we had a director, they said, our friends are Jewish and they want to know what happened here. And it was one of the most moving trips. And, the first time we met them, I don't know how you guys feel, but you meet people that are German and talk about bias. And finally, she wanted to know how we spelled Goldman. And I said, we're Jewish. And they said, oh, yeah. And we talked about what did their family and and they said they were both of their family. One of them they didn't live in the cities. They were in the outskirts, and one was in prison in France. And I don't know where Manfred's. Oh,
He was in East Germany and then went.
he wasn't. Oh yeah, and then but he was from a time from East Germany when they were younger. So that's a whole other discussion how he escaped to the West Germany.
Yeah.
But the Holocaust is definitely something that is mandatory in Germany.
Well, good. Paula? And
Well,
then Merle.
I didn't learn this until I was, after I was married, but my father was part of the platoon that liberated Mauthausen, the 13 men and there was a picture in the paper of a local VFW troop honoring the fallen leader of this platoon. And in this picture was a picture of my father.
Oh, how wonderful.
And we had no idea because he could never speak of it. And the reason for saying this is that my father probably suffered from PTSD, only we never knew that because at that time, guys who didn't come home well from the service were shell-shocked and there wasn't much treatment for them. He had a great deal of rage and anger and hatred for the German people. He was there from 1939 to 1945. And when he said, he had told my mother that when they had approached, my mother knew the story, my mother was still alive. My mother said that when they approached the city, the smell from the crematoria was evident hundreds of miles away. And he was always angry at the German people that he met that said, oh, we didn't know. We had no idea. We didn't know. And it was sad because he had so much unresolved. He would have been a valuable person to talk to and to have learned from, but he couldn't get past his experience to be a teacher of it at all.
Yeah. Merle, go ahead.
When I was teaching English as a second language to Russian immigrants and other immigrants, we heard a lot of very sad immigrant stories. And there was one woman that I worked with who wrote a book about her mother, who was a survivor of a whole family that was lost in the Holocaust. They sent her away by herself to the United States. She suffered from survivor's guilt her whole life. So her daughter, the woman that I worked with, wrote a book called Gypsy Music Street. And the author's name is Roberta Dietzen. It's a wonderful story about how the daughter goes back to what was Hungary then, to see her, just to take the footsteps that her mother took through the town. She went to see all of the Holocaust locations near there. And it's the most beautiful book. And it was self-published, but you can get it on Amazon. It's called Gypsy Music Street. And I cried through the whole book. It was so beautiful. So the survivors suffered too because of survivors' guilt.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if you go back and look, because I have been a student of Holocaust education, in 1979 or 1977, the mini series Holocaust came out. It had Meryl Streep and James Wood. And I was at the University of Michigan, and that's when there was only one television. You didn't have, one in your room and one in your pocket. And we were in the lounge, and of course, it was predominantly, I was in a dorm with a lot of Jews, and we were watching it glued. And there was a lot of second generation Holocaust kids sitting there. And it was that year, a very good friend of mine, Daniel Derman, his parents, Lisa and Aaron Derman, who I brought them, but they've been gone probably about 20 years now. They started speaking in the early 80s. And that show, let them gave them, okay, people are talking about it. I think in the 60s and early 70s, people didn't want to hear it. I mean, these stories are so hard to listen to, read, see. Rabbi was just talking yesterday in the film group that Schindler's List, has shown we're lucky that Steven Spielberg is one of the greatest filmmakers, and he made this film which was able to explain what was going on. Another sad thing as we look at 2021, COVID is many Holocaust survivors are dying of COVID, they're getting older. I'm sure it's there's many different reasons why, but it's just hard to see that. And there are some Holocaust survivors who do still come out and speak. I could not find one who could Zoom and was available on April 11th. So I went down a generation. And the same thing happened last year. It's the technology isn't easy. And I think, what Marilyn said, that seeing the person in person is you're never going to forget that. We've had many speakers. I think we had one here at Macomb and many at Legacy Lakeside, and it was well attended and people were just fascinated. I also had another good friend, and her parents were in Auschwitz. And I said, and probably, I was in my 20s, maybe early 30s. And maybe I said, well, what's their story? Because as a Jewish educator, I was dedicated in teaching this and getting it out. And she goes, we don't talk about it. We never asked them. And I said, what? I was dumbfounded. But when we think Howard Reich was here, and he talked about, he had a book about his conversations with Elie Wiesel, and he has another book, and there was a movie about his mother, and that his mother had PTSD, and no one had diagnosed it, and she was a survivor, and they didn't really talk about it, and so it's just fascinating. Okay, Marcia, and then Paula. And Marcia, you need to unmute.
Okay, I'm trying. Okay. Okay, thank you. A few years ago, I was at a Shiva for a dear biking friend, and his daughter one of his daughters works for, like, if there's an archive, like a Holocaust archives in New York City, and they they take recorded stories from all of these Holocaust.
Yeah, Spielberg has this where you can record your story and they videotape you, and I think it's in New York and out west in LA.
Yeah, and she said that some are very, they don't push anyone that is unwilling or unable because of PTSD and all of that. But they gather as much as they can, and some of them are willing to tell their stories but not be recorded. And then they capture as much of it that they can. So that's one thing. And another thing is, when I was in Illinois, I worked for the Bernard Wenger JCC in Northbrook, and a bunch of us went to, before the Holocaust Museum near Old Orchard was there. There was a house. There was a small old
It was
house.
on Main Street in Skokie. It was
Right.
like a storefront.
Right.
Yeah, I remember.
And a woman, a survivor, started telling the story of her and her sister. And she was a little girl, and her sister was ill. She had some chronic illness, and she succumbed. I think after they were liberated, she succumbed to, well, plus all of the horrible treatment. But she would go across the concentration camp to bring her rations, her milk, to her sister, to her little sister. And the women who were in charge of it would yell "shrine" at her. I mean, a little kid, an 8-year-old kid. She was like 8 years old and her sister was 6, and she gave her bread and her milk. I mean, it was just and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. I mean, the story was just heart-wrenching. And so I think another thing that I got out of that story, just like out of the Book of Lost Friends, which was like freed slaves during the Reconstruction, how they were still treated horribly, and then this Tender Land, which is the Native American struggle with little kids. But it's like one thing in the Tattooist of Auschwitz. He said, how can a human being do this to another human being? I think that the humanity to the inhumanity to man, and then there are moments when there is great humanity, when someone else is suffering and gives what they have to another person. So I just wanted to relate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Paula?
I just wanted to say my experience as a teenager and in college was having met families that were a part of Holocaust survivor families. Was two completely different extremes. We didn't talk about it at all, and we were friends with other families who had experienced the Holocaust in some way, or people like who Spielberg found, who were willing to talk, who wanted to share the experience, wanted it to be understood and never forgotten. So I never came across too many friends and family members who were sort of on the fence. It was one extreme or the other, never to be spoken about again or never to be forgotten.
Yeah. And I think the plethora of literature, I run a couple of books, Joyce, I'll get you in 1 minute, book groups. And if I wanted, if you could do a Holocaust only book group for years. And I usually have to limit how many Holocaust books I ask my group to read, because there's some really fantastic, and they're fiction, but going through every different part. But just trying to find something that's on a different time period, it can be difficult.
And it's heavy emotionally, just as a reader participant.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Joyce.
Just wanted to share that I had a friend, Mari Forsythe, maybe some of you may even know her. Her husband and she put together, but I knew her from the time we were young, newly married women, and she never, ever mentioned the story of her life prior to the time 30 years later when she said to me and asked me as a favor, "Joyce, would you mind? Alex and I are going to be putting together our story from when we were in Germany. She didn't even say the Holocaust. And we need someone to be able to transcribe it as we dictate it to them so that we can put it together. And I did that for her. And the
Oh,
book,
goodness.
Oh,
is
how
called
special.
Mari's Story, and
Wow.
with pictures, and I could not believe that for all those years, Mari didn't tell me a thing about her life and the results of living through the Holocaust, and her
Oh,
husband's
man.
story as well. She
Wow.
met her husband in a DP camp, is where they actually met, and then came to this country and married. But this is true for so many of the survivors, that the initial years after the incidents, they want it pushed, they don't want to talk about it. We in this country, and I have to admit, I was totally ignorant, never asked her about her background. And here this came out in this most beautiful book that she wrote. And all I did was type on the computer while she dictated to me the story.
Wow.
That is beautiful,
Beautiful.
absolutely beautiful. And I also resonate with what Peggy said. As a family, we drove through just a little part of Germany, mainly through France. And when you saw the older generation, in my head, I was like, oh, where were you during the war? Where were you? Where were you? And it's a terrible thing, but you can't help it, Susan, and you need to unmute.
Yeah. Well, my husband did a lot of business in Germany. And so I've been there many times because we traveled there. And at one point, they had just purchased a German company, because my husband was the head of a conglomerate and they bought other companies. And they had purchased this German company, and we went to, they were having a dinner, and all the celebration and all this business. And this old man, who was the chairman of the company they bought, I mean, there's no doubt that he had been a Nazi. I mean, this was, oh my God, I'm trying to think back, and it was in the 70s. I could not shake his hand. And my husband was just, I mean, it was strictly business, but it was hard for him, really hard.
Yeah.
And one day they were taking him somewhere, and the man that was driving him was the son of Joseph Goebbels.
Mm.
And my husband's business associate said, when he found out that he said, he looked at my husband and said, my God, you turned white. This other guy wasn't Jewish, but he saw Dick's reaction, and he literally almost got sick that he was driving in a car with this person.
Yeah.
As Jewish people, it doesn't really, the feelings don't leave us.
No.
So 2 years ago, my daughter and granddaughter and I were in Berlin, and I take my husband and I, and when he was alive, we did this. We always took our grandchildren on a trip somewhere for their bar bat mitzvah gift. And my granddaughter wanted to go to Berlin. And it's incredible what they are doing in Berlin regarding the Holocaust. You cannot escape it. It is everywhere, with the little bronze tablets in the street and on the buildings, and with the names of victims, and the railroad, and everywhere you go is remembrance and reminding people of what the German people had done. They don't let you forget.
Yeah. So the Shoah, the Holocaust was a business. They made money on the Jews in those factories. So, here you are meeting with business people, my mind would have been in overtime. Now, some Americans and American Jews kept doing business with them. And because it was just business, it's money. And so it's very hard to divorce that. And, there was a time when Jews didn't, drive Mercedes, and my husband just he leases, he has an Audi, and I didn't realize that was from Germany, because I said no Mercedes. And I mean, and I can't remember where Rabbi was talking about this, and because I'm on too many things with him, but we were, when Germany made reparations, they made huge reparations. And in Israel, the cab drivers, the buses, they're all Mercedes because that was part of the reparations. So the Germans have certainly tried to, and Rabbi was talking about making reparations to African Americans today. It must have been a tourist. I'm not 100% on that. It was? Okay, thank you. At least I'm giving him credit that he said it. And I also think that Berlin, especially, my personal kids went there, Israelis, tons of Israelis. It's like the hot place. And, you know, it's new and open and you got to go. And my husband, he's like, yeah, I'm not interested. I am interested.
The Jewish museum there is fabulous.
Yeah. And did you go to a concentration camp?
Oh yeah, we went to Sachsenhausen.
Yeah.
And I mean, my little granddaughter, you know, she was terribly moved. And I mean, it was a good education for her.
Yeah.
You know, I was worried of what it was going to do to her, but I think it gave her a much firmer feeling about her Judaism.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, the museum there is something else.
Yeah.
It's.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, and people in America got reparations. You know, we have friends in the family and they got reparations and that put so-and-so through college. So, you know, they're definitely, I mean, you cannot forgive them for what they did, but at least there's some remorse. And it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, certainly when I look at, you know, world leaders, you know, I think Angela Merkel, I adore her. Peggy.
You know, don't you think, Vanessa, and you know, there's a new generation of German people now. And even though some of the right-wing people are rearing their ugly heads with anti-Semitism, just as is happening in our country and other places in the world, but for the most part, the younger people in Germany are ashamed of what their grandparents or their parents were involved in.
I hope so.
And
I hope
think
so.
we have to move forward.
Yeah.
And not feel that you're going to punish the people that are living today for what happened, you know, 75 years ago by people who are no longer even alive.
Peggy, then Marcia.
One of the things that we saw while we were there talking to our friends, that when how could they turn away 1 million Muslims?
Right.
Right? And that kind of turned not so nice for the people that are the German people are not happy. They used to love Angela. You know, that was their hero. And how could she refuse 1 million Muslims? Well, you know, I mean, our friends live in a small city in Germany, Dusseldorf. Well, it's not so small. They're in Neuss, which is outside of Dusseldorf, and they put 500 people, 500 Muslim refugees in their town, and said, "You find places for them." And they weren't I don't know how happy I would be about that, but you know, but there was that, she made a decision because she couldn't say no. And I respected her for that.
Yeah, there's a tension there. Absolutely. Marcia, go ahead.
Okay, just wanted to say that I have a very good friend, my friend who lives in Wilmette, and her father was a lawyer in Germany. And in 1933, they took away his practice. And so his family saw the writing on the wall and they left. They didn't, you know, like so many German Jews thought it's going to get better. We're German. Well, anyway, he left and went to Israel, and and he met his wife there, whose family had the similar experience, and they moved there too. But then when it got it started to get really bad with, the Arab neighbors attacking the not yet state of Israel. They moved to Chicago area, where most of his law practice was on reparations for Holocaust survivors. And he had volumes of heart-wrenching stories, and he was able to get a lot of reparations. And my friend said, those Holocaust deniers, all they have to do is read some of the stuff in my father's books. Unfortunately, she didn't save them. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Marcia. The one thing, and we're getting towards the end here and a couple roundups, but what Paula said that that was your grandfather, your father,
My father.
your father,
Yeah.
that they could smell it. And I remember in college, in the early, 1979, whatever, I had a huge argument with a friend, a non-Jewish friend, and she was studying German and German this and German that. And they said, oh, the people of Germany. I said, look, Lynn, they knew. They all knew you could smell it. She goes, no, they didn't know. The people up in the country, they didn't know. But I was like, ugh. And we could never really come to an agreement on that. And she knew the Holocaust was bad and, it was perpetrated, by the Nazis. I said, no, you have to be, you can't be a silent majority. And I think we have seen that in the United States. I know we had huge campaigns here at Macomb to get out the vote and to do everything so that we can have a say, that we can't stand silently by. And that is definitely for me a lesson of the Holocaust, that you have to be an upstander. And I think that's also how they teach the kids in school, and they know what an upstander is. And, I'll say to the kids, it's hard when somebody's, picking on someone, to go in and say, stop it. That's even harder than when you're being picked on, to confront the bully or to step out of your comfort zone. So, I, and maybe Marilyn, your grandson, this was also, a lesson of when you hear a survivor. So, Susan, you're muted.
It goes back to that thing. If you see something, say something. And I mean, they say that, all the time. When I took my granddaughter, to Sachsenhausen, but my husband and I had been to Buchenwald, and we had also been to Dachau. And if you go to these camps, especially you get off the train to go to Dachau, the houses are right there. There's no way those people didn't know about it. I mean, the community is right there. The gates of the camp are maybe 1 block away. There is no way those people did not know.
I haven't talked to her as an adult, and I'd be dying to see if she's changed her mind. Paula, go ahead.
Well, it looks like we have 45 senators who forgot what they saw on January 6th. So
yes, we do.
Yes,
yeah,
unfortunately.
Stand up. We're trying to teach these morals, the things that we live by, and it's just very disheartening to see this.
And it's like gaslighting, like, oh, that didn't. Yes, we saw it happen. They wanted to kill Pence.
So if some among them died, would they speak up? What is it going to take? What will it?
I totally, completely agree with you.
On the news last night, I heard that a lot of these senators they only listen to Fox News. They haven't seen some of the video, and they haven't read or heard some of the things that came out of Trump's mouth, and that when they actually have the trial and they show the evidence, it's going to be very hard for some of them to deny what they're going to see that they've never seen before. We can only keep our fingers crossed and hope that it has some impact on them.
Maybe,
but I doubt it.
Maybe that should be their required Holocaust education.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Real.
All right. Thank you,
Oh, and,
everyone.
I just want to tell you, Vanessa,
Yes.
thank you. But I want to tell you, because of Macomb, Solel Lakeside, because of your actions, we got back the Senate.
I hope so. That's
Oh,
what
yeah.
that's what I, I'm right
Thank
there with you,
Vanessa.
Marcia. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you
Thank
next.
you.
We still have to
Thank
talk about Israeli elections, but we have another.
Right.
All right. be
Thank
well,
you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you for a great session, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you all.
you.